Hi, my name is Syed Mohammad Taghavi and I'm a professor at the Chemical Engineering Department at University Laval. Today we would like to talk about the art of an effective scientific presentation. The first thing to point out is that delivering a presentation is difficult and it requires a lot of practices, especially because during our education we are not trained for public speaking. And in fact, public speaking is among the most fears and phobias of people. In addition, we frequently attend presentations that include bad deliveries, bad slides, too much text, bad figures, bad presentations in general. So today we would like to provide some tips in this lecture so that we can avoid such disastrous situations. Before we move on to the content of the lecture, I would like to point out that most of what I will be presenting today is taken from this book called The Craft of Scientific Presentations by Michael Alley, although I have used some other sources which will be mentioned at the end of the lecture. In this lecture, we will cover a few points to improve our scientific presentations. Of course, what we will cover is not comprehensive, but rather selective on some of the main issues that are important in the presentation. The lecture outline is as follows. We will first talk about the speech, structure, and delivery. Then we will go through some PowerPoint tips, followed by some examples of typical errors in PowerPoint presentations and preparation. Finally, we will wrap it up with a few presentation tips and summarize the lecture at the end. Let's start with the speech. There are in general 4 sources of speech relevant to giving presentations. These include extemporaneous, memorizing, reading, and impromptu. The extemporaneous presentation is a speech in which the speaker memorizes the organization of the talk, but not the exact wordings that he or she will use in the presentation. In an extemporaneous talk, the speaker practices the talk several times so that he can be sure of the organization and he can also make the words on the spot. Sometimes the speaker prepares a list of notes so that he does not or she does not forget the main points of the presentation. There are pros and cons for this type of presentation. In terms of the advantages, the presenter can earn credibility because of the confidence that he has or she has during the presentation. And can easily adjust the speech when needed, and the presenter can have a very good eye contact with the audience. In terms of the disadvantages, one can say, for example, that the wording is not exact, a lot of preparation is needed, and also another aspect is that the presentation has a natural pace. So some people view it as a good aspect, some view it as a disadvantage in a presentation. I personally actually view it as a good aspect in a presentation. Let's look at a good example of an extemporaneous speech taken from a 2019 speech and debate competition in the United States. In this short video, you will clearly see that the presenter is confident in what he's saying, which makes him credible or seem credible, and he will have a very good eye contact with the audience.
In April of last year, I was in my living room watching a Black Lives Matter demonstration unfold on TV. Protesters demanded justice in one corner while police stared solemnly from the other. And that's when something unforgettable happened.
The second source of speech is through memorizing. In this case, the presenter completely memorizes the presentation, sort of word by word. The advantages of this presentation include the precision in the presentation, smooth delivery, earning credibility, and good eye contact. The main disadvantage is the potential for disaster. For example, if the presenter suddenly forgets what he or she was going to say, which can happen quite often. There could be also an unnatural and sometimes annoying pace in the presentation. There is no flexibility to adjust the presentation on the spot, and finally it requires a lot of preparations. Let us show an example of a memorized speech from Emma Watson's United Nations speech in 2014. You will witness that Emma Watson will be precise and smooth in her delivery. She will be also confident and seem confident, which earns her credibility, and she will have a very good eye contact with the audience. However, you will also notice that she will seem a bit unnatural and slightly robotic.
The more I have realized that fighting for women's rights has too often become synonymous with man-hating. If there is one thing I know for certain, it is that this has to stop.
Another source of speech is direct reading, in which the presenter is basically reading from prepared notes. The advantage of this type of speech is the precision and also the smooth delivery. However, the obvious disadvantages would be the unnatural pace, lack of eye contact, inability to adjust the speech, and a lack of credibility. Let's look at an example of a reading speech from Albert Einstein. In his presentation, you will see that the presentation will be precise and smooth, but you will also witness the unnatural pace, lack of eye contact, and less flexibility to adjust the speech. It is worth pointing out that Albert Einstein was known to give confident and credible speeches, but here, as you will see, he will read it from a prepared note, and you will feel a lack of credibility in this speech.
We are concerned here with an act of humanity, with the maintaining of cultural values, and not least with a measure of considerable political importance.
For reading type speech, these days people, especially politicians, typically use teleprompters. As you can see in this short video of Donald Trump addressing the United Nations in 2020, you will see that the presentation will be precise and smooth, but it will have an unnatural and robotic aspect to it.
We rapidly produced a record supply of ventilators, creating a surplus that allowed us to share them with friends and partners all around the globe. We pioneered life-saving treatments, reducing our fatality rate 85% since April.
The impromptu presentation is a speech in which the speaker is presenting sort of off the cuff and basically improvises his or her speech. Of course, this type of presentation is advantageous in that there is no preparation. Also, there is usually a great eye contact with the audience. On the negative side, the speaker can become lost very easily and can have difficulty in organizing thoughts and speech. Due to improvising, he or she cannot use the visual aids that are prepared in advance. So, what are the appropriate situations to use any of the types of the speeches that we talked about? First of all, the best strategy is to use practiced extemporaneous speech in scientific presentations. For example, in conferences, courses, and lectures. Memorized speech can be perhaps best used for the first few words of the presentation so that your engine can start up and you can go through the presentation. Another example of this type of speech is through a short, for example, if you want to give a short intro to a speaker. Reading can be used when you are basically quoting a quotation or you want to use complex wordings. The impromptu approach can be used, for example, for asking and answering questions. This is because you cannot prepare for these in advance. Let's move on to the presentation structure. In a scientific presentation, you as the presenter are a guide leading the audience up to the mountain of your research work. This is the analogy that we will use in this lecture. As you will see in this representative image, you are going to climb this mountain of the work, and by climbing this mountain, you want to show the audience the view that you as a researcher have attained in your hard work as a researcher. In this analogy, one important aspect is the route itself, marked by the dashed line in this image. For example, the entry at which point you begin to climb. Or, for example, the organization of the talk, which is the fact that you are moving up to the mountain of the research work, including the direction and ending point. Speed is very important. So not to go very slowly, not to go very fast, so that you don't bore your audience or you don't lose them. Transitions keep the audience on trail, so you should try to limit the number of the changes in the directions in your presentation, for example, in the sections of the talk. And you want to also properly signal any change in the direction to your audience. And finally, good emphasis guides the audience to appreciate the view. You want to emphasize the key aspects of the presentation, otherwise your audience will miss the important views and sights that they can enjoy from your research. This is a visual depiction of the organization of your scientific presentation. You begin with the big picture of the presentation at the start of your presentation, then focus on your work, on your research work in the middle, and then come back out to the big picture at the ending of the presentation. In essence, the ending discusses the results of your work on the big picture, which you introduced at the beginning of your presentation. The beginning should in fact show the big picture of the presentation, show the importance of the work, provide needed and necessary background of the work, and establish in this way the credibility for you as the presenter, and properly map the presentation. The middle discusses the topic in a logical fashion. Of course, what is logical depends on the topic of your research. The middle is usually broken up into different segments so that the speaker can cover what is needed to lead the audience for the nice sights and views of his or her research work. The way you would organize the middle would depend on the audience as well. If you are targeting multiple audiences, the organization of your presentation would be much more challenging. This timeline represents how to reach multiple audiences in a presentation by beginning at the surface of the topic, diving into the subject, and then surfacing back to gather the entire audience. In other words, if you dive into data, you would also need to enable the audience to tune back as you're presenting to multiple audiences. In the ending, you should analyze the work from an overall perspective, summarize the most important details, provide closure for the presentation, give sets of recommendations, especially, for example, if you are dealing with industrial partners. They usually like these sets of recommendations for their practices. State how the work affects the big picture that you introduced at the beginning. As you can see, you start with the big picture and you end with the big picture. Let's talk about how you deliver your talk. Delivery is a critical part of any presentation. Improving your delivery can be certainly achieved by practicing and getting feedback from your audience. You can get the audience, especially if they are your friends, for example, to give you feedback through a checklist that can cover, for example, passion and confidence, controlling nervousness, having a clear voice and being engaging, appropriate speed, effective eye contact, and appropriate timing, and so on and so forth. These days, most presentations are made using the PowerPoint software, so let's provide some useful tips in this regard. Let's talk about typography, starting with font style. First of all, select a font type that is read quickly. This is the aim of the text in your presentation. In this regard, the best choice is to use sans serif fonts such as Arial, Calibri, and Helvetica, and avoid using serif fonts such as Times New Roman, Times, and Bookman. The serif fonts have specific edges, and they are not appropriate. They are not appropriate for presentations. They are more appropriate for textbooks. The second advice is to use an appropriate size for the fonts that you use in your presentation, depending on the presentation room. And also try to limit the number of the font sizes in your presentation. For example, for the headlines, the font size of 28, 36, or 44 are used, with 36 points being the optimum, perhaps. For supporting text, use 18, 20, 24, or 28 points, with 18 and 24 being the most frequent. For the reference listing, the font size can be smaller, for example, 12 or 14 points, with 12 points being quite frequent. In fact, the reference font size can be small because they are not the focus of the work, but they are mainly there to keep the integrity of the citations, and also they can be used by the audience later if they wish to get into basically a reference in more detail. Finally, avoid presentation text in all capital letters. As you can see in this text that I provided, it's in all capital letters and it's not easily read, and you need to avoid using all capital letters. In terms of the colors, always use contrasting colors in your presentation. The table here shows an example of good and poor color combinations which you can use in your presentation. For the background, avoid hot colors such as red, orange, or yellow, as they are irritating to the eye and they do not provide good contrast when you put text in front of them. Typically, white background is quite good. Finally, avoid backgrounds with decorations because they are either distracting or make the presentation illegible. In terms of the layout, let's talk about what to avoid. First of all, avoid putting text blocks of more than 2 lines. Nobody would read them, nobody would be able to read them. Second, avoid grouping more than 4 items. For example, giving a list of 15 items would be very confusing and sort of disastrous. Avoid using irritating animations. I intentionally put an irritating animation example here, and you can see that this animation is not useful and is rather distracting. So don't forget that the animations must serve the audience, not distract them or irritate them. While we are on this topic, also avoid fancy transitions between the slides in your presentation. Finally, do not fill all the blank spaces in your presentation. Be generous with the blank spaces and let your presentation slides breathe. Okay, now we can look at some examples of catastrophic errors in PowerPoint preparations. Look at this slide. Obviously, you cannot read anything because of the image in the background. So avoid putting images in the background. Let's look at this example in this slide. There is too much text and too much information. So this is a typical example of bad communication, when you provide too much information so that the audience gets lost and they cannot even follow the text. Here is another example of presenting too much information in a slide. Obviously, this situation must be avoided. The error in this slide is obvious. The text is not legible because the contrasting colors that we suggested have not been used. It actually hurts the eyes if you try to look and read the text in this slide. In this slide, the font type is not appropriate. As we mentioned, it is suggested to use sans serif font types. So this can basically, the text can be read more easily. Avoid using fancy font types, as you can see in this slide, which is an example of bad choice for the font type. In fact, you want your audience to read the materials that you are putting there, not to be impressed by the font and the fanciness. Look how many graphs are in this slide. How can a person explain all these graphs quickly in a presentation? If you use graphs or plots in a slide, show them one of them or show a few of them and try to explain each of them carefully. Explain what the axes are, explain what the content is. Do not forget that this is the first time the audience is seeing the graph, and it takes time for the audience to understand what the graph or plot is actually showing. Here is an example of using confusing figure in the presentation slide. If the intention in this slide, for example, is to focus on the red arrows, why not removing the other arrows? For example, by Photoshop, and simplifying the image so that the audience can understand what's going on. This is an example of bad use of animation. As you can see, each element of this slide is animated separately, so it takes much longer to finally show them all and go through them. Also, each element has more than one animation. It takes the slide, it takes time for the slide to load, and it distracts the audience, obviously. And so don't forget that the main thing is to serve the audience if you use animations, to understand, to or to better understand, and you do not want to make them confused. So don't make a circus of useless animations in your presentation. We are getting to towards the end of this talk, so let's provide a few presentation tips. Let's provide some general presentation tips, not in a specific order. Your presentation, you can assume that, is like a puzzle in which all the pieces must fit together so that you can have a good impact on the audience. First, do not forget that less is more in the presentation slides. Do not forget that filling out too much in the presentation is not going to be helpful, and sometimes it's going to be confusing to the audience. So avoid slides with too much confusing stuff in them. Simple is better. Simplicity is better than complexity, or better than useless complexity. Try to simplify the complicated and confusing materials in your presentation. In simple words, do not make your audience suffer. Timing is a very important aspect in the presentation. Some people still use the rule of, for example, 1 slide per minute, which can be sometimes useful. Practice your presentation. This is very, very important to practice and get feedback. Present just enough convincing data so that the audience can understand the concepts that you are communicating. Do not put too much data. Do not put too little data. Reveal the organization of the presentation to your audience. This is not a surprise contest. So you don't want to basically confuse them. You don't want to surprise them that, okay, the presentation is suddenly going in a different direction that you showed at first. So you want to audience to know how the presentation unfolds. Watch good presentations and try to imitate those good presentations. Some good examples can be found in TED Talks. Use images in your presentations. We are visual primates, so it makes us more comfortable, and we can understand the images better than text most of the time. Too much text sometimes can be boring for us. Build the content of your presentation progressively, step by step. If you are not going to talk about something, just leave it out from your presentation and do not put it in the slide. If needed, repeat the key images of your presentation in different slides. It's sometimes useful to repeat images or structures sometimes in the corresponding divisions of the presentation. Try to keep a logical flow in your presentation. And finally, do not assume a lot of things. First of all, do not assume the audience knows what the presentation is about. Things that are obvious to you may not be obvious to the audience. In conferences, do not assume that the audience knows who you are and even what your affiliation is. So present yourself, say your name, say your affiliation. Let's end this lecture with a brief summary. In terms of the speech, so we learned that we should know when to use the 4 sources of speech. In terms of the structure of the presentation, we learned that we need to structure the presentation with a beginning, with a middle, and with an ending. For the delivery, we should benefit from a delivery checklist when possible. In terms of the PowerPoint software, pay attention to the typography, colors, and layout. And finally, avoid errors and apply our presentation tips. Here is a list of few references which I have used for this lecture. I would like to thank you for your attention to this lecture.